At my granddaughter's wedding reception, her new mother-in-law introduced me to the guests as just an old man who sells used furniture. She had no idea I was holding a champagne flute worth more than her car, or that the simple family heirloom I'd given as a wedding gift was actually an 18th century Fabergé necklace valued at $2.4 million. When I smiled and said, "Actually, I'm a curator of rare antiquities," her face went white. But that was only the beginning of the education I was about to provide. Before we continue, please subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories. The morning of Isabella's wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of September day that made Newport's coastline sparkle like scattered diamonds. I stood in my walk-in closet, running my fingers along the row of bespoke suits, each one tailored on Savile Row during my more active years in the auction house business. Today called for something special, but not ostentatious. The charcoal huntsman with subtle pinstripes would do perfectly. As I fastened my grandfather's pocket watch chain, I caught my reflection in the antique mirror that had once belonged to a French duke. 73 years old, silver hair perfectly groomed, blue eyes still sharp despite the decades. People often underestimated me now, seeing only an elderly gentleman instead of the man who had spent 45 years building one of the most respected rare antiquities businesses on the East Coast. My phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. "Grandpa can't wait to see you today. Thank you again for the beautiful necklace. It's perfect with my dress." I smiled, thinking of the Fabergé piece I'd selected from my private collection. To most people it looked like an elegant but simple pearl necklace with ornate gold settings. They would never guess it was crafted in St. Petersburg in 1847, commissioned by Tsar Nicholas I for his daughter. The workmanship was exquisite, the pearls naturally cultivated in the Baltic Sea, each one perfectly matched. Christie's had valued it at $2.4 million during their last appraisal of my collection. But to Isabella, it was simply a loving gift from her grandfather, something beautiful to wear on her special day. That's how it should be. Family heirlooms weren't about monetary value, they were about love, tradition, and connection across generations. I walked through my mansion, past display cases filled with museum-quality pieces, Ming vases, Renaissance sculptures, medieval manuscripts, Byzantine jewelry. Each item had a story, a provenance I could recite from memory. The insurance company called it a $47 million collection. I called it my life's work. The drive to the breakers would take 30 minutes, giving me time to think about Isabella and how proud I was of the woman she'd become. At 26, she was finishing her master's degree in art history, following in footsteps I'd never pushed her toward, but was delighted she'd chosen. Her fiancé, Christopher, seemed like a decent young man, though I knew little about his family beyond the fact that his father owned several car dealerships in Connecticut. The Breakers venue was magnificent, exactly what Isabella had dreamed of for her wedding. Rolling lawns overlooking the Atlantic, a historic mansion backdrop, gardens that had been manicured for over a century. The rental fee alone was $25,000, but seeing Isabella's face when she toured the property had made every penny worthwhile. I parked my Bentley and walked toward the reception area, nodding to familiar faces. Isabella's mother, my daughter Caroline, rushed over in a flutter of pale blue silk. "Dad, you look wonderful," she said, straightening my already perfect tie. "Isabella's been asking for you." "She's in the bridal suite, but the ceremony starts in 20 minutes. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" Caroline's smile was bright but strained. "You know how it is. Wedding stress. Christopher's mother has very specific ideas about how things should be done." Something in her tone made me pause. "Problems?" "Nothing serious, just different styles." The Ashford family is very modern in their approach to things. Before I could ask what that meant, the wedding coordinator appeared with a clipboard and a stressed expression. "Mr. Whitmore, we need to get you seated. The ceremony is beginning." I found my assigned seat in the third row, which struck me as odd, since I was the bride's grandfather and had paid for a significant portion of the wedding. The first 2 rows were filled with people I didn't recognize, all bearing a strong resemblance to Christopher. The Ashford clan, apparently. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Isabella looked radiant in her grandmother's restored wedding dress, the Fabergé necklace catching the afternoon light perfectly. When Christopher lifted her veil to kiss her, I felt the familiar tightness in my throat that came with watching my granddaughter become a married woman. But it was during the cocktail hour that things began to feel off. I was standing near the bar, sipping an excellent Chateau Margaux, while admiring the way the late afternoon sun hit the ocean, when a woman in an expensive but gaudy gold dress approached me. She was perhaps 55, with the kind of blonde hair that came from a bottle and jewelry that screamed new money rather than whispered old elegance. "You must be Isabella's grandfather," she said, extending a manicured hand heavy with diamond rings. "I'm Patricia Ashford, Christopher's mother." "A pleasure to meet you, Patricia." Beautiful ceremony. She looked me up and down with the calculating gaze of someone assessing value. "Yes, well, we certainly spared no expense. Though I have to say, I was surprised when Christopher told me about the venue cost. The Breakers is lovely, but there are more practical options for young people just starting out." I sipped my wine, saying nothing. In my experience, people like Patricia always revealed themselves if you gave them enough rope. "Are you enjoying your retirement?" she continued. "Christopher mentioned you're in the furniture business." "Something like that," I replied neutrally. "How nice." It must be rewarding, helping people furnish their homes affordably. Though I imagine the profit margins are quite thin these days with all the big box stores. I felt my eyebrows rise slightly. Furniture business? Affordable? Thin margins? Someone had clearly given the Ashford family a very incomplete picture of my professional background. "The antique business has its challenges," I agreed mildly. "Oh, antiques." Patricia's voice took on that patronizing tone people used when they thought they were talking to someone quaint but irrelevant. "How charming. Christopher's father and I have been thinking about picking up some vintage pieces for our lake house. Nothing too valuable, of course, just something with character. You'll have to give me your card. I'm sure you have wonderful pieces at reasonable prices." Reasonable prices? I managed to keep my expression neutral while internally marveling at the woman's assumptions. She was looking at me and seeing a small-time dealer in second-hand furniture, probably running a dusty shop in some forgotten corner of Newport. "I'd be happy to discuss pieces with you," I said. "Wonderful. I love supporting small local businesses. It's so important to help people like you stay afloat in today's economy. People like you." The condescension was breathtaking, but I maintained my composure. After 4 decades in the auction house world, dealing with pompous collectors and ignorant nouveau riche, I'd developed considerable patience for this sort of thing. The conversation was interrupted by the dinner chime, and we moved toward the reception tent. I noticed that I'd been seated at table 8, while the Ashford family occupied the prime spots near the head table. Again, unusual for the grandfather who had contributed substantially to the wedding expenses, but I said nothing. Dinner conversation at my table was pleasant enough. I was seated with some of Caroline's friends and a few distant relatives, all of whom knew me well enough to treat me with appropriate respect. But I couldn't help overhearing snippets from the nearby Ashford table, where Patricia was holding court. "Such a sweet old man, but you can tell he's struggling a bit." Furniture repair business, I think. Very humble background. Caroline's side of the family is certainly more modest than I expected. I cut my filet mignon with precise movements, each bite perfectly sized, while listening to myself being discussed like some charity case they'd graciously allowed at their family celebration. When the time came for toasts, Christopher's father stood first. Richard Ashford was a large man with the confidence that came from success in business, though his success was clearly more recent than inherited. "To my son, Christopher, and his beautiful bride, Isabella," he began, raising his glass. "The Ashford family is proud to welcome Isabella into our circle. We've built our family business through hard work and determination, and we look forward to continuing that legacy with the next generation." He went on about the Ashford work ethic, their business acumen, their plans to guide the young couple toward financial success. The implication was clear. The Ashfords were the family with money and wisdom, while Isabella's side was lucky to be included in their prosperity. When Caroline rose to speak for our family, her words were gracious but brief. She mentioned how proud she was of Isabella, how welcome Christopher was in our family, but she kept her remarks general. She made no mention of her own successful career as a museum curator or of the family legacy that had shaped Isabella's love of art and history. After dinner, as guests mingled and the dancing began, I found myself standing alone on the terrace, looking out at the ocean and reflecting on the evening's subtle slights. The third-row seating, the table placement, the casual dismissal of my background, it all painted a picture of how the Ashford family viewed Isabella's relatives. "Grandfather?" I turned to find Isabella approaching, radiant in her wedding dress, the Fabergé necklace catching the light from the paper lanterns strung overhead. "My darling girl," I said, opening my arms for a hug, "you look absolutely beautiful." "Thank you. And thank you again for this gorgeous necklace. Mrs. Ashford was asking about it earlier. She said it was cute and wanted to know where you found such a nice costume piece." My grip on my champagne flute tightened almost imperceptibly. Costume piece. "What did you tell her?" "I said it was a family heirloom from your collection." She seemed surprised that we had any real jewelry in the family. Isabella's voice carried a note of confusion. "Grandfather, did I say something wrong?" She got this odd look on her face. "You said nothing wrong, sweetheart. Tell me, what exactly has Christopher shared with his family about our background?" Isabella looked uncomfortable. "I think there might have been some misunderstandings. Christopher knows you're successful, but I don't think he realizes the scope of your business. He told his parents you were in the furniture trade, and somehow they got the impression—" She trailed off. "The impression that I run a second-hand furniture shop?" She nodded miserably. "I tried to explain tonight, but Mrs. Ashford said something about not everyone being comfortable with the reality of their financial situation, and that it was sweet how I wanted to make the family sound more impressive than we really are." The insult hung in the evening air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Patricia Ashford thought my granddaughter was lying about our family's status to impress her precious son's family. Don't worry about it, Isabella. These things have a way of working themselves out. But, grandfather, I hate that they don't understand who you really are. Should I tell them about your collection? About the museum exhibitions you've curated? About the auction houses? I patted her hand gently. Let's not spoil your wedding day with such concerns. Tonight is about you and Christopher, not about business or status or any of that nonsense. But even as I spoke the reassuring words, I was thinking about the conversation I'd overheard at dinner. The Ashford family had made their assessment of Isabella's relatives, and they'd found us wanting. In their minds, they were the sophisticated ones, the successful ones, the ones with real money and influence. It would be interesting to see how long that confidence lasted. The evening continued with dancing and more mingling. I made polite conversation with the Ashford relatives, each interaction confirming their assumptions about my modest circumstances. Christopher's uncle asked if I did furniture repairs. His cousin wondered if I ever found really valuable stuff in estate sales the way they did on those television shows. Patricia herself suggested I might want to network with their interior decorator, who was always looking for affordable vintage pieces for her less wealthy clients. Through it all, I smiled and nodded and let them build their comfortable narrative about the humble furniture dealer who had somehow managed to pay for his granddaughter's education and contribute to her wedding expenses. They probably assumed I'd mortgaged everything for Isabella's sake, the way some grandparents sacrifice their retirement savings for their grandchildren's futures. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Patricia approached me one final time. "Mr. Whitmore, it's been such a pleasure meeting you. I do hope we'll stay in touch. As I mentioned, we're always interested in supporting small local businesses. That's very generous of you, Patricia." "Not at all. We believe in giving back to the community. In fact, Richard and I were just discussing how we might be able to help Isabella and Christopher get started in their careers. Richard has connections in the art world through his dealership's corporate clients. We could probably find Isabella a position with better prospects than museum work. Better prospects than museum work. The woman was suggesting that her husband's car dealership connections could provide my granddaughter with superior career opportunities to those available through her master's degree and family connections in the legitimate art world. "That's very thoughtful," I managed. "We just want what's best for the children. And frankly, Christopher is going to need to be the primary breadwinner in this family. Isabella's education is lovely as a hobby, but art history doesn't pay the bills, does it? Thank goodness Christopher has the Ashford business sense." She patted my arm with the condescending affection reserved for elderly relatives who needed gentle management. "Now, you take care of yourself, dear. And remember, if you ever need any business advice, Richard started with nothing too, you know. We're always happy to help family." I watched her walk away, her gold dress catching the light strung throughout the reception tent, her confidence absolute. In her mind, she'd just extended gracious charity to Isabella's poor but proud grandfather, offering to lift our family up through Ashford generosity and superior business acumen. As I drove home through the quiet Newport streets, past mansions that had housed America's wealthiest families for generations, I reflected on the evening's education. The Ashford family had shown me exactly what they thought of Isabella's heritage, and, by extension, what they thought of Isabella herself. They saw her as the fortunate recipient of their son's affection, elevated by marriage into a family of substance and sophistication. They believed they were doing us all a favor by welcoming such a humble girl into their prosperous circle. It was, I realized as I pulled into my circular driveway, a perspective that required correction. The next morning I sat in my study with my first cup of coffee, surrounded by the tools of my actual trade. Auction catalogs from Sotheby's and Christie's lay open on my mahogany desk. Correspondence from museum curators decorated one wall, thanking me for various loans and donations over the years. On another wall hung photographs of myself with collectors, dealers, and scholars from around the world, evidence of 4 decades building relationships in the international art and antiquities market. I opened my laptop and began researching the Ashford family businesses. Richard's car dealerships were successful enough, generating perhaps $50 million in annual revenue across his 5 locations. Certainly nothing to sneeze at, but hardly the kind of wealth that justified looking down on other families. More interesting was what I found about Patricia's background. Born Patricia Kowalski in Hartford, Connecticut, she'd worked as a secretary at Richard's first dealership before they married. A classic story of social mobility through marriage, which perhaps explained her need to establish hierarchies with other families. I made some notes, then reached for my phone. My first call was to Margaret Henley at Sotheby's. "Theodore, how wonderful to hear from you. How was the wedding?" "Educational," I replied. "Margaret, I have a favor to ask. I'd like to arrange a small consultation appointment for later this week. Nothing formal, just a chance for some friends to better understand the art market." "Of course. What kind of pieces are they interested in?" I looked across my study at the glass case containing some of my favorite smaller pieces. "Let's start with jewelry. Antique jewelry, specifically. I think they might benefit from understanding how provenance and craftsmanship affect value in that market." "I'd be delighted to help. Should I prepare anything special?" "Just bring your expertise, Margaret, and perhaps some recent auction results for comparable pieces. I have a feeling my friends might be surprised by current market values." After arranging the appointment, I made 2 more calls. The first was to Christopher, suggesting lunch later that week to welcome him properly to the family. The second was to Isabella, proposing a small dinner party at my home where the 2 families could get to know each other better in a more intimate setting. Both young people were enthusiastic about the idea of bringing their families together. Isabella mentioned that her new in-laws had expressed interest in seeing more of Newport, and Christopher said his parents would love to visit my home. Perfect. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing my collection, selecting pieces that would be appropriate for display during the dinner party. Nothing too overwhelming. I didn't want to shock the Ashfords into speechlessness, just enough to provide some context for their assumptions about Isabella's family background. The baccarat crystal would be perfect for the dining room. The Meissen porcelain could grace the living room, perhaps the small Degas sketch in the hallway, and definitely the Byzantine chalice that always caught visitors' attention. I was particularly looking forward to showing them the library, where first-edition manuscripts sat alongside modern scholarship on art history and archaeology. The Ashfords might be interested to learn about the papers I'd published over the years or the lectures I'd given at various universities. But first, there was the matter of the Fabergé necklace. I walked upstairs to Isabella's old room, which I'd preserved exactly as she'd left it after college. On her dresser sat a framed photograph from the wedding, Isabella and Christopher cutting their cake, her radiant smile brightened by the necklace's subtle gleam. Patricia had called it a costume piece, a cute little trinket from grandfather's modest collection. I picked up my phone and dialed Isabella's number. "Grandfather, I was just thinking about you. The wedding photos are going to be gorgeous." "I'm sure they will be, darling." "I was calling about the necklace, actually. I was hoping you might wear it to our dinner party this weekend." "Of course." Mrs. Ashford mentioned again how much she liked it. She asked if you might have other pieces in a similar style. I think she wants to commission something for her anniversary." "How thoughtful of her." "Tell me, Isabella, what did you share with her about the necklace's history?" "Just that it was a family heirloom from your collection, like I told you." She seemed very interested in the craftsmanship. She said her jeweler could probably make something inspired by it, but with better stones. Better stones. I had to sit down. "Grandfather, are you there?" "Yes, darling, I'm here." "Did she mention what she thought the necklace was worth?" "She said it was probably very precious to our family for sentimental reasons, even if it wasn't particularly valuable. She was actually quite sweet about it. She said she understood how families treasure pieces like that, even when they're not museum quality." "Not museum quality." The Fabergé necklace that had been featured in 3 major exhibitions and was currently insured for $2.4 million was, in Patricia Ashford's expert opinion, not museum quality. "Grandfather, you're being very quiet. Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect, Isabella. I'm very much looking forward to our dinner party." Wednesday afternoon brought Margaret Henley to my front door, carrying her signature black leather portfolio and wearing the kind of understated elegance that came from 30 years in the luxury auction world. Margaret was perhaps 55, with silver-streaked hair and the sharp eyes of someone who could spot a forgery from across a crowded room. "Theodore, this house never fails to take my breath away," she said as I led her into the living room. "How do you decide what to display and what to keep in storage?" "Rotation," I replied, settling into my favorite armchair. "Though I confess I've been giving more thought lately to how pieces are perceived by different audiences." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh? That sounds intriguing." I poured tea from the Georgian silver service, a gift from a grateful client whose estate I'd helped arrange 20 years ago. "Tell me, Margaret, in your professional opinion, what would be the appropriate way to educate someone who has completely misunderstood the value of a significant piece?" "Misunderstood how?" "Let's say someone looked at a Fabergé necklace and called it costume jewelry." Margaret nearly choked on her tea. "A Fabergé? Theodore, surely no one could mistake Fabergé craftsmanship for costume jewelry. You'd be surprised what people can mistake when they've already decided what they're looking at." "Which piece are we discussing?" I walked to the glass display case and retrieved the documentation for the necklace Isabella had worn at her wedding. Margaret's eyes widened as she read the provenance papers. "This is the Romanov commission piece. Theodore, this necklace was featured in the Hermitage exhibition 5 years ago. It's worth $2.4 million, according to your last appraisal." "And someone called this costume jewelry?" Margaret's voice carried the particular outrage reserved for professional insult. "Who exactly are we dealing with here?" I explained the situation, the wedding, the assumptions, Patricia's confident dismissal of both the necklace and my professional background. Margaret listened with growing amazement. So this woman, who has no background in art or antiquities, decided to educate you about the jewelry market. It gets better. She offered to have her jeweler make me something similar, but with better stones. Margaret set down her teacup with a sharp clink. "Theodore, this is professional malpractice of the highest order. When is this dinner party?" "Saturday evening. I was hoping you might join us and perhaps share some insights about the current market for antique jewelry. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Shall I bring some comparable auction results? That would be educational." We spent the next hour planning the evening's revelation. Margaret would arrive after dinner, ostensibly to examine some pieces I was considering for auction. The conversation would naturally turn to the necklace, and Patricia would learn exactly what she'd been so confidently dismissing. "Theodore," Margaret said as she prepared to leave, "in 30 years of working with collectors, I've never seen anyone quite this eager to provide free education to people who insulted them." "Education is important, Margaret. Some people simply need more comprehensive instruction than others." Saturday arrived with perfect October weather. Crisp air, brilliant sunshine, the kind of day that made Newport's autumn foliage glow like stained glass. I spent the morning with my housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, reviewing the menu and table settings. Everything had to be perfect, not because I wanted to impress the Ashfords, but because I wanted them to understand exactly what they'd been so casually dismissing. The dining room looked magnificent. The 18th-century mahogany table gleamed under the crystal chandelier that had once graced a Venetian palazzo. The baccarat crystal caught the afternoon light, throwing tiny rainbows across the Persian carpet that had been woven for a Mughal emperor. Nothing ostentatious, nothing vulgar, just the quiet elegance that came from 4 decades of careful collecting. At 6 o'clock sharp, the Ashfords arrived in Richard's new Mercedes. Through the window I watched Patricia step out, her gaze immediately cataloguing the exterior of my home with calculating interest. The Georgian mansion had been built in 1887 by a shipping magnate, and I'd spent 15 years carefully restoring it to period perfection. I opened the door before they could ring the bell. "Richard, Patricia, how wonderful to see you again. Please come in." Patricia's eyes went wide as she stepped into the entrance hall. The soaring ceiling, the period moldings, the carefully placed museum lighting, it all spoke of wealth that was both substantial and tasteful. "Theodore," Richard said, shaking my hand with slightly more enthusiasm than he'd shown at the wedding. "Magnificent home, absolutely magnificent. Thank you. It's been a labor of love to restore it properly." Patricia was turning slowly, taking in the Flemish tapestries, the Italian marble, the collection of medieval manuscripts displayed in climate-controlled cases along the wall. This is quite impressive," she managed. "Just a few family pieces," I replied modestly. "Nothing too special." We moved into the living room where Isabella and Christopher were already waiting with Caroline. Isabella looked radiant in a simple black dress that perfectly showcased the Fabergé necklace. Christopher had clearly prepared his parents for the house. His expression suggested proud vindication rather than surprise. "Can I offer anyone a drink?" I asked. "I have a nice Chateau d'Yquem if anyone enjoys dessert wine, or perhaps some champagne. I have a bottle of Dom Perignon 1996 that's been waiting for the right occasion." Richard's eyes lit up. "Dom Perignon 96? That's a serious vintage. The last of my case, actually." I thought meeting my granddaughter's new family qualified as a special occasion. As I poured the champagne into glasses that had been crafted by the same artisan who made pieces for the French royal family, I noticed Patricia's attention shifting between the room's contents and my casual treatment of obviously expensive items. "Theodore," she said carefully, "I have to ask, this collection is quite extraordinary. How long have you been gathering these pieces?" "Most of my career," I replied. 45 years in the business gives you time to find remarkable things." "The business," Richard repeated. "Christopher mentioned you were in furniture?" I smiled. "Antique furniture, among other things, though I've always been drawn to pieces with particular historical significance. We moved to the dining room, where Mrs. Chen had prepared a meal that would have been at home in any 3-star Michelin restaurant. As we settled into chairs that had once belonged to Napoleon's sister, Patricia kept glancing around with an expression that suggested rapid mental recalculation. "This is absolutely delicious," she said, tasting the first course. "Theodore, you must tell us about your business. I think we may have underestimated the scope of your operations." "Just a small specialty practice," I replied. "I work with clients who are interested in museum-quality pieces. Nothing too commercial." "Museum quality?" Richard repeated slowly. "What kind of clients?" "Private collectors, mostly. Some institutions. The Metropolitan occasionally asks for consultation on acquisitions." Patricia's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "The Metropolitan Museum?" "Among others. The Getty, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Nothing too exciting, just helping them authenticate pieces or understand provenance." The conversation continued through the main course, with the Ashfords asking increasingly specific questions about my work. I answered honestly but modestly, mentioning my relationships with auction houses the way another person might mention their grocery store preferences. "You seem to know the art world quite well," Patricia said as Mrs. Chen cleared the dinner plates. "Well enough," I agreed. "When you've been in the business as long as I have, you tend to meet people." It was at this moment that the doorbell rang. "Ah," I said, glancing at my watch. "That would be Margaret." "I hope you don't mind. I asked a colleague to stop by after dinner. She's examining some pieces I'm considering putting up for auction." Mrs. Chen showed Margaret into the dining room, and I stood to make introductions. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Margaret Henley." Margaret is a senior specialist in jewelry and decorative arts at Sotheby's. Margaret swept into the room with professional grace, her portfolio in hand, and her expert gaze immediately taking in both the room's contents and its occupants. "Theodore, thank you for including me in this lovely gathering," she said warmly. "I hope I'm not interrupting dinner." "Not at all. We were just finishing up. Margaret, let me introduce you to my granddaughter Isabella and her new husband Christopher, and Christopher's parents, Richard and Patricia Ashford." Patricia straightened in her chair, clearly recognizing the significance of the Sotheby's name. "How wonderful to meet you all," Margaret said, settling into the chair Mrs. Chen had prepared. "Theodore, I brought those auction results you requested, and I have to say I'm fascinated by what you described earlier." "Auction results?" Patricia asked. "Oh, yes," Margaret replied brightly. "Theodore called me about some jewelry appraisals. Apparently, someone has been giving him advice about antique pieces, and he wanted a second opinion." I watched Patricia's face as the implications began to register. "Speaking of which," Margaret continued, "Isabella, that necklace you're wearing is absolutely gorgeous. Is that the piece Theodore mentioned?" Isabella touched the necklace self-consciously. "Yes, it was grandfather's wedding gift to me." "May I take a closer look?" "Professional curiosity, you understand." Isabella leaned forward, and Margaret examined the necklace with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades evaluating precious objects. "Extraordinary," she murmured. "Theodore, the craftsmanship is even more remarkable than I remembered. The provenance on this piece is impeccable." "Provenance?" Patricia asked weakly. "Oh, yes, this necklace has quite a history. Fabergé, 1847, commissioned by Tsar Nicholas I for his daughter Grand Duchess Olga. The pearls are naturally cultivated Baltic varieties, each one hand-selected for perfect matching. The gold work shows Fabergé's characteristic attention to detail." Patricia had gone very pale. "Fabergé? One of the finest examples I've seen outside of major museum collections," Margaret continued enthusiastically. "We had a similar piece sell at auction last spring for just over $2 million, though it lacked this one's royal provenance." The silence around the table was deafening. "$2 million?" Richard's voice came out as a croak. "Oh, this one would go for considerably more," Margaret said cheerfully. "The Royal Commission documentation alone adds significant value. Theodore, what was our last insurance appraisal on this piece?" $2.4 million, I replied calmly, sipping my wine. Patricia looked like she might faint. $2.4 million? "Market value," Margaret confirmed. "Though, of course, pieces like this rarely come to market. Most are held in private collections or museums." I watched Patricia's face cycle through shock, embarrassment, and dawning realization. The costume jewelry she'd dismissed so confidently was worth more than her house. I had no idea," she stammered. "When I saw it at the wedding, I thought—" "Yes, Theodore mentioned that," Margaret said with professional interest. "He said you'd offered to have your jeweler make something similar but with better stones." I have to say, I'm curious about your jeweler's background. Anyone who thinks they can improve on Fabergé's craftsmanship must have extraordinary credentials. The question hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Patricia opened and closed her mouth several times before managing to speak. I think there may have been some misunderstanding. Oh, I hope not, Margaret replied brightly. I'm always interested in meeting skilled craftspeople. The jewelry world is quite small, you know. Most of us know each other's work. Richard cleared his throat. Margaret, I think perhaps my wife spoke out of turn. We're not particularly knowledgeable about antique jewelry. No shame in that, Margaret said graciously. It's a specialized field, though I have to say most people are more cautious about offering opinions on pieces they're not familiar with. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear under the table. Theodore, Margaret continued, opening her portfolio, I brought those auction results you requested. Recent sales of comparable Imperial Russian pieces. She spread photographs and documentation across the table, each one showing jewelry that had sold for millions of dollars. Fabergé brooches, Cartier tiaras, Imperial Easter eggs, a catalogue of the world's most expensive antique jewelry. The market has been particularly strong for pieces with royal provenance, Margaret explained. Collectors are paying premium prices for anything with documented imperial history. Patricia stared at the photographs with the expression of someone watching their assumptions crumble in real time. This is fascinating, Christopher said, clearly trying to break the tension. Margaret, how does someone get into this kind of work? Usually through art history programs, though Theodore took a different path. His reputation in the field is quite remarkable. Reputation? Richard asked. Oh, yes, Theodore is one of the most respected antiquities dealers on the East Coast. His expertise in authentication and provenance research is legendary. The man has an eye for quality that's simply unmatched. Margaret turned to Patricia with professional interest. I understand you mentioned that Theodore might benefit from business advice? I have to say, that's fascinating. Most people in our field consider him something of a mentor. The silence stretched until Isabella spoke up. Mrs. Ashford thought grandfather was struggling financially. She offered to help him find business opportunities. Margaret blinked. Struggling? Theodore, didn't you just complete that acquisition for the private collector in Switzerland? The one with the Renaissance sculptures? A small commission, I replied modestly. $12 million commission is hardly small, Margaret laughed. Though I suppose it's all relative in this business. Patricia made a sound that might have been a whimper. Well, Margaret said, closing her portfolio, I should let you all get back to your family time. Theodore, thank you for letting me examine the necklace again. It really is one of the finest pieces I've encountered. As she prepared to leave, Margaret turned to Patricia one final time. Mrs. Ashford, I hope you'll reconsider your offer to help Theodore with business advice. In our industry, experience and expertise are everything, and Theodore has both in abundance. I'd hate for you to waste your time trying to educate someone who literally wrote the textbook on antique jewelry authentication. After Margaret left, the dining room fell silent except for the ticking of the Louis XVI clock on the mantel. Patricia sat frozen in her chair, her face cycling through various shades of mortification. Well, Richard finally said, his voice carefully controlled, this has been educational. I smiled. I do hope so. Theodore, Patricia whispered, I owe you an enormous apology. Do you? At the wedding I said some things. You offered to help me find affordable vintage pieces for your less wealthy clients. I recalled, and you suggested that your husband's car dealership connections might provide Isabella with better career prospects than museum work. Each word hit like a physical blow. Patricia's confidence, so absolute at the wedding, had crumbled completely. "I didn't know," she said desperately. "I thought—" "You thought I was a struggling furniture dealer who'd mortgaged his future to pay for his granddaughter's education." She nodded miserably. "May I ask what gave you that impression?" Christopher said, "He said you were in the furniture business." All eyes turned to Christopher, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "I said antique furniture," he protested. "I told them you dealt in antiques." "But you didn't mention the scale of his business," Isabella said quietly. "You didn't mention the museum connections or the auction houses or the fact that he's internationally recognized in his field." Christopher's face flushed red. "I didn't think it mattered. I mean, you never talk about money or status or any of that stuff, Theodore. You just seemed like a regular grandfather who happened to have nice things." "And that," I said gently, "is exactly how a gentleman should behave." The lesson landed with perfect precision. Real class didn't announce itself. Real wealth didn't need to be displayed. Real sophistication was quiet, understated, secure enough not to need validation from others. Patricia had spent the entire wedding weekend proclaiming her family's superiority based on assumptions and ignorance. She'd dismissed Isabella's grandfather as irrelevant, offered condescending charity to a man whose collection was worth more than her husband's entire business empire. "I'm so embarrassed," she whispered. "How can I possibly make this right?" "There's nothing to make right," I replied. "You made natural assumptions based on incomplete information. The fault lies with whoever gave you that incomplete information." Again, all eyes turned to Christopher. "But perhaps," I continued, "this might serve as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that courtesy is always the safer choice when meeting new people." The drive home was silent for the Ashford family, but I imagine it was filled with the kind of reflection that comes when one's worldview has been thoroughly dismantled. For my part, I felt a quiet satisfaction as I watched their Mercedes disappear down my driveway. Justice, I had learned over the years, was often best served quietly and with perfect timing. Isabella lingered after her in-laws departed, helping Mrs. Chen clear the dishes while Christopher made awkward conversation about the house's restoration. The young man seemed genuinely ashamed of his family's behavior, which spoke well of his character. "Grandfather," Isabella said as we stood in the library afterward, "I have to ask, did you plan all of this?" I considered the question while gazing at a first-edition manuscript of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. "I planned to educate some people who seemed to need education. Whether they learned anything remains to be seen." Mrs. Ashford looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. Embarrassment can be a powerful teacher, though it's not always a permanent one. Christopher joined us, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Theodore, I owe you an apology. I should have been clearer with my parents about your background. I never meant for them to treat you that way." "You didn't treat me any particular way, Christopher. You simply failed to provide context that might have prevented some awkward assumptions. It's just, you never talk about money or status or any of that stuff. You're not like the wealthy people I've met before. And how are wealthy people supposed to behave?" Christopher looked uncomfortable. "I don't know. More obvious about it, I guess. The people my dad deals with through the dealerships, they make sure you know they have money." "Ah," I said, understanding. "New money versus old money. It's a classic distinction, though not always a meaningful one." I led them to the window overlooking the gardens, where carefully maintained hedges created geometric patterns that had been designed by the same landscape architect who worked on the Vanderbilt estates. "Christopher, let me share something my father taught me when I was about your age. He said that truly successful people rarely feel the need to announce their success because their success speaks for itself. The people who talk constantly about their wealth are usually either insecure about it or haven't had it long enough to feel comfortable with it." "Is that why you never mentioned your collection or your business connections?" "I mentioned them to anyone who asked genuine questions, but I don't introduce myself by listing my net worth or my professional achievements." "Would you find that attractive in a person?" "No," Christopher admitted. "It would seem kind of gross, actually." "Exactly. True sophistication is quiet. It doesn't need to prove itself." Isabella smiled, linking her arm through mine. "Grandfather, you should have seen Mrs. Ashford's face when Margaret started talking about the necklace. I thought she was going to faint. Your new mother-in-law learned a valuable lesson tonight about making assumptions. Do you think she'll remember it?" I considered Patricia's behavior throughout the evening, the way her confidence had crumbled when confronted with reality, the genuine mortification in her voice when she attempted to apologize. "Time will tell. Some people learn from embarrassment and become more thoughtful. Others simply become more careful about hiding their prejudices." "What about the necklace?" Christopher asked. "Are you comfortable with Isabella wearing something so valuable?" "Christopher, that necklace has survived the Russian Revolution, 2 world wars, and numerous changes of ownership. I think it can handle being worn by my granddaughter to dinner parties." "But what if something happens to it?" "Then something happens to it. Objects are meant to be used and enjoyed, not locked away in vaults. The necklace means more to me on Isabella's neck than it would sitting in a safety deposit box." We talked for another hour, covering everything from the house's history to my early years in the antique business. Christopher seemed genuinely interested in learning about the art world, asking thoughtful questions about how I'd built my collection and developed my expertise. As they prepared to leave, Isabella hugged me tightly. "Thank you for tonight. Not just for teaching the Ashfords a lesson, but for showing Christopher what real class looks like. Your husband is a good man, Isabella. He simply comes from a family that measures worth differently than we do. With time and patience, those differences can be bridged." After they left, I walked through my empty house, turning off lights and securing the valuable pieces that had served as props in the evening's education. Each item had a story, a history that connected it to people and places across centuries. The Ashfords saw dollar signs. I saw the continuation of human creativity and craftsmanship across generations. My phone rang just as I was heading upstairs. Caroline's name appeared on the screen. "Dad, Isabella just called and told me about dinner. She said Margaret from Sotheby's was there. A small consultation about some pieces I'm considering for auction." "Dad." Caroline's voice carried that particular tone children use when they know their parent is being deliberately obtuse. "What did you do to the Ashfords?" "I invited them to dinner and showed them some family heirlooms." "Very civilized affair." "Isabella said Patricia looked like she'd seen a ghost when she learned about the necklace. People are often surprised by the value of antique jewelry." "It's not uncommon." Caroline sighed. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "I'm enjoying having had the opportunity to clear up some misconceptions that were causing unnecessary tension in our family. Promise me you're not planning any follow-up revenge schemes." "Caroline, my dear, revenge is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as continuing education." The next week passed quietly. I returned to my normal routine of research, correspondence with colleagues around the world, and the occasional consultation for private collectors. On Thursday, I received an unexpected phone call from Richard Ashford. "Theodore, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I got your number from Christopher." "Not at all, Richard. How can I help you?" "I wanted to apologize again for Saturday night. Patricia and we made some assumptions that were completely inappropriate. As I told your wife, there's nothing to apologize for. We all make judgments based on incomplete information. That's generous of you, but we were out of line. The truth is, we were intimidated by Isabella's education and accomplishments, and I think we made ourselves feel better by assuming her family wasn't as sophisticated as ours. The honesty was refreshing and unexpected. We'd like to make it up to you somehow," Richard continued. "Patricia suggested we might donate to one of the museums you work with, as a gesture of respect." "That's very thoughtful, Richard, but unnecessary." "Please, we feel terrible about how we treated you. At least, let us do something to show we've learned from our mistakes." I considered the offer. A charitable donation would indeed demonstrate that the Ashfords had internalized the evening's lessons. Moreover, it would benefit institutions I cared about. "If you insist, the Metropolitan Museum always appreciates support for their conservation efforts, but please don't feel obligated." "We want to." "How much would be appropriate?" "Whatever feels right to you. The amount matters less than the gesture." After we hung up, I found myself genuinely impressed by Richard's call. It took character to admit error so directly, and his offer to make amends suggested that the family might indeed have learned something valuable. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the Metropolitan Museum's Development Office thanking me for facilitating a substantial donation from the Ashford family. The amount, $50,000, was significant enough to suggest genuine remorse rather than token gesture. More importantly, I began receiving regular updates from Isabella about her improving relationship with her in-laws. Patricia had apparently become much more interested in learning about art and antiques, asking thoughtful questions rather than making confident pronouncements. She'd even enrolled in an art history course at the local community college. Christopher, meanwhile, had begun joining me for monthly lunches, during which we discussed everything from his career plans to his growing appreciation for museum-quality art. He was turning out to be an excellent addition to the family, thoughtful, curious, and refreshingly free of his parents' social anxieties. 6 months after the dinner party, I received another surprise call, this time from Patricia herself. "Theodore, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to share some news." "Of course, Patricia. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you. I actually called because I wanted you to know that I've been accepted into a master's program in art history at Yale." "Patricia, that's wonderful news. Congratulations. I wanted to thank you for inspiring me to pursue this. That evening at your house opened my eyes to how much I didn't know about art and culture. Instead of being embarrassed about my ignorance, I decided to do something about it." "That's admirable, Patricia. Education is always worthwhile. I was wondering, would you be willing to write me a letter of recommendation for an internship at Sotheby's? I know it's a lot to ask, given how I behaved initially." I smiled, remembering the woman who had offered to help me find affordable vintage pieces for less wealthy clients. "I'd be honored to recommend you, Patricia. Your commitment to learning speaks very well of your character." "Thank you." "And Theodore? I hope you know that I've learned my lesson about making assumptions about people." "I'm sure you have." 1 year after Isabella's wedding, I hosted another dinner party. This time, the guest list included not only the young couple and the Ashford parents, but also Margaret from Sotheby's, several colleagues from the museum world, and a small group of serious collectors who had become friends over the decades. Patricia arrived carrying a leather portfolio filled with her research on provenance documentation, her final project for the Yale program. She presented her findings with the confidence of someone who had earned her expertise through study and dedication rather than assumption and prejudice. During cocktails, I overheard her having an animated discussion with Margaret about recent auction results for Imperial Russian jewelry. Her knowledge was impressive, her questions sophisticated, her manner respectful rather than presumptuous. "She's become quite the scholar," Margaret murmured to me as we watched Patricia examine a Byzantine manuscript with proper reverence. Hard to believe this is the same woman who called Fabergé costume jewelry. People can change when properly motivated. What motivated her? I smiled, watching Patricia carefully handle the ancient parchment while Christopher and Isabella looked on with obvious pride. The realization that true sophistication comes from knowledge and humility, not from assumptions and arrogance. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Patricia approached me one final time. "Theodore, I wanted you to know that this year has been transformational for me. I'm a better person because of what I learned that night." "I'm glad to hear it, Patricia. Education is always rewarding. I hope you can forgive me for my behavior at the wedding and afterward." "There's nothing to forgive. You simply needed to learn something, and you did." She smiled, the expression genuine rather than calculated. "Richard and I were talking recently about how lucky Christopher is to have married into your family. Isabella's foundation in art and culture is remarkable." "Isabella's foundation comes from her own intelligence and curiosity. Family can provide opportunity, but individuals must choose what to do with it. Still, having a grandfather who literally wrote the textbook on antique authentication doesn't hurt." I laughed. That textbook sold perhaps 300 copies, mostly to graduate students and fellow professionals, hardly bestseller material. But it's cited in every major work on the subject since publication. The fact that Patricia knew this and understood its significance demonstrated just how far she'd come in her education. As the last guests departed and Mrs. Chen finished cleaning the dinner service, I sat in my study reflecting on the evening. The Ashford family's transformation had been remarkable to witness. Patricia's journey from ignorant arrogance to genuine sophistication provided proof that people could change when confronted with their limitations and given the opportunity to grow. More importantly, Isabella and Christopher's marriage had been strengthened by the process. Instead of ongoing tension between families with different values and backgrounds, we now had mutual respect and shared interests. I opened my laptop and began drafting a letter to the curator at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. They had been asking about borrowing the Fabergé necklace for an upcoming exhibition on Imperial Russian jewelry. The piece would be displayed alongside other surviving works from the same period, providing context for visitors to understand its historical significance. Isabella would be traveling to Russia for the exhibition opening, wearing the necklace one final time before it joined the temporary display. The sight of my granddaughter in St. Petersburg, representing our family at an international cultural event, would be worth more than any monetary value. I finished the letter and prepared for bed, satisfied with the evening's success. The house was quiet around me, filled with beautiful objects that had witnessed centuries of human history. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to learn, to teach, and to appreciate the remarkable creativity that connected all generations. The Ashford family had learned that true wealth lay not in the size of one's bank account, but in the depth of one's knowledge and the quality of one's character. They had discovered that sophistication was earned through education and humility rather than assumed through prejudice and arrogance, and I had been reminded that the most satisfying victories were those that lifted up former adversaries rather than simply defeating them. Justice, as it turned out, was best served with a side of redemption.